NATO leaders are working to find a joint response to the Russian drone incursion into Poland Wednesday. European officials call it a deliberate provocation. NATO forces shot down several drones over Poland, with some reported hundreds of kilometres inside the country. It was the first time the Western alliance has had to shoot down potential threats in the airspace of one of its members. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk says the country is now closer to open conflict than at any time since the Second World War. Over to our correspondent in Brussels, Anchal, Vohra. How are European representatives reacting the day after?
Well, the reactions have come in and reactions have been very clear, and that has been support for Poland and support for Ukraine will continue. The message to Moscow there is, and I've been talking to a lot of analysts who said this, that if the idea was to deter European allies from supporting Ukraine going forward, including potential troop deployment, then that hasn't happened. European allies are not discouraged. This morning, the Danish embassy has invited European ambassadors for a breakfast meeting. It was pre-planned, but there's no doubt that they would be discussing the drone attack on Poland and essentially, in more concrete terms, how to strengthen Europe's defence industrial complex. Now, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has spoken about a drone wall. This is the work that now needs to begin. The day after, this is what the leaders are going to be discussing, how to turn this into a reality. There is no doubt here amongst the allies that if the eastern flank is protected, well guarded, then that protects all of Europe. But how to make this drone wall a reality? It requires a lot of money. It requires a lot of coordination between different member states, but also between different industry actors. Of course, the allies intend to take an advantage of everything that Ukraine has learned in drone warfare over the last 3 years. And yet a lot more needs to be done, specifically in the sector of surveillance capabilities. In the Ukraine war, the allies and Ukraine depended essentially largely on US's surveillance capabilities. These are important because these are your eyes in the sky. They tell you if the troops are deploying, where the troops are deploying. And even with a drone wall, this is important because essentially, how do you stop a hostile drone from attacking a population center before the attack occurs? So all of these capabilities require coordination and money, but also time. What's clear is a sense here in Brussels that the conflict in a way has escalated and Europe has no option but to prepare.
You heard it from DW's Anchal in Brussels for us. Well, the events in Poland have made previously scheduled military exercises currently being held in the Baltic Sea all the more important. Germany and 13 other countries are taking part in the exercises. The Baltic region has become the target of suspected Russian sabotage and espionage activities in recent times. The drills take place as Russia and Belarus get set to hold their own military exercises not too far away. DW's correspondent Julia Sardelli witnessed some of the exercises in the German city of Rostock and sent us this report.
This may be a drill, but these troops are practicing scenarios that seem all too real. These soldiers are securing the route from Rostock on the northern German coast to the Baltic Sea. Their mission: keep military convoys moving safely to Lithuania. They're protecting the precious cargo, tanks and infantry vehicles loaded onto a civilian ferry, against threats from the air or the water, be it drones, boats, or submarines. This is all part of a military exercise called Northern Coasts. 40 vessels and 2,700 soldiers from 14 different countries, including Germany and the Baltic Sea states. The exercise scenario feels plausible, with troops on the move to Lithuania, where the threat of a possible Russian attack looms large.
The threat remains unchanged, both hybrid and conventional. Putin is watching us. His plans extend beyond Ukraine, and as armed forces, we must prepare for this.
Northern Coasts and the Baltic Sea are central to this year's Quadriga military exercise series. And it's not just by coincidence. The Baltic Sea has been the target of suspected sabotage and espionage activities by Russia. Cargo ships suspected to be part of Moscow's so-called shadow fleet have cut underwater internet and power cables. And Germany has repeatedly intercepted Russian spy planes flying in the region. That's why these exercises are so important. It's not just about practicing to be ready in case of a military escalation or an attack. It's also about deterrence and showing Germany's presence.
We practice so we can show that we are ready to defend ourselves and capable of deterrence. You can only do that if you practice, practice, practice. And why do we practice? Because we see a threat.
This year's Quadriga exercises also couldn't have been timelier. As these soldiers train here in European waters, a few hundred kilometers away in Belarus, Russian and Belarusian troops prepare to start their own military drills. Every 4 years, tens of thousands of Russian allied soldiers take part in exercises called Zapad, meaning West. 2021 Zapad drills offered the perfect cover for the buildup of troops ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Germany says there are no indications that anything other than training will take place this year. But here in Rostock, it remains a strong reminder that a potential threat to Europe's security is right nearby.
Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Matthew Moore. These drills had already been planned, as we mentioned, but has this drone incursion by Russia into Poland created a new sense of urgency?
I think it almost certainly has. I mean, this incursion really will just underline the threat that faces Europe, faces NATO allies, and the threat that is predominantly coming from Russia. And yesterday in the Bundestag, the German parliament, the defence minister, Boris Pistorius, made exactly that point. He said that, we'd long warned in recent years that Russia was waging a hybrid war against Europe, and he said that this incursion into Polish airspace was just the latest example of that. And he also referred to things like the undersea cables being cut in the Baltic Sea, which we heard about in that report, or breaches of airspace in the Baltic Sea. But this was just the latest example, he said. We're not talking about attempts to meddle with infrastructure. We're talking about armed drones, he said. So a deliberate provocation, and again a reminder to the people involved in these exercises in the Baltic Sea. There's thousands of soldiers just involved, taking place in these drills, and it's a reminder to them that this is a very real threat.
So what response can we expect from Germany?
Yeah, that's the big question today. So Chancellor Friedrich Merz spoke last night. He, for the first part of this, he said, that he shares Donald Tusk, the Polish Prime Minister's assessment that this was not an accident. Important to stress that. And he talked about a very serious threat to peace throughout Europe. I expect there'll be more discussions, and he said that there will be more discussions among NATO and European allies. And he basically underlined the pledge that Europe, he said, will remain ready to defend itself. Yesterday, a government source here in Berlin said that this was a test. And it was a test of two things. It was a test of air defences, a test of whether NATO had resolve. And so there's two questions really that arise from this test. Did NATO pass the air defence, the operational test? On the one hand, no one was hurt, and it was a joint collaboration among NATO allies to thwart these drones, but it was just 19 drones. So some people are saying, would Europe and NATO's air defences have been able to withstand a much more complex attack involving many drones and missiles? Some believe the answer is not quite so clear. And the second thing is, what is going to be the response? Is NATO united? I think some people here in Europe, and especially in Berlin, will be looking at Donald Trump's response and saying, where's the condemnation? So today we'll see whether or not there's going to be a diplomatic response. They could ramp up air patrols, and they could also do something to give Ukraine more support to target Russian drone facilities.
Okay, certainly something that everybody here is talking about. Matthew Moore with the analysis on that story.
And that potential threat to Europe's security became even more real yesterday when Russian drones entered Polish airspace. Ian Lesser is a leading expert on European security and NATO. He is the head of the German Marshall Fund's Brussels Bureau. Ian, it's good to have you with us. Does yesterday's drone incident mark a new level of escalation in Russia's approach to NATO's eastern members?
Well, good to be with you. And it's hard to understand precisely what happened. I mean, we saw what happened, but what was behind it? Were these simply drones that went astray, or was this something intentional, intended to probe NATO's defenses, intended to test how Poland and allies would respond? Very difficult to know, but it does, I think, underscore the fact not only that we have this mounting threat of Russian aggression spilling over further from Ukraine to affect the Baltic in particular, but also the potential for something simply to go wrong, for incidents of this kind, or even things much more serious in the Baltic, to escalate, perhaps to be misunderstood, perhaps not, but in ways that NATO would have to respond to very quickly. So these exercises become extremely important in that context.
I mean, has the threat level for Poland and Eastern Europe changed because of the drone breach?
Oh, I think it absolutely has. I mean, you could argue that this risk was there, this threat was there already. And of course, there are much more serious threats that are possible. These drones were not highly sophisticated weapons. You could imagine much more sophisticated attacks if Russia wanted to do that. I'm not arguing that they would, but things, again, can go wrong. Part of this is, I think, about deterrence, as you have said, but part of it's also about reassurance to regional allies, reassurance to the alliance as a whole that NATO is prepared to deal with these contingencies.
How do you assess the immediate response by Poland and NATO? I mean, was it strong enough to send a clear message to Moscow?
I think there are two pieces to this. One is the immediate response, apparently about 4 of these drones were shot down. Now, that may not tell us very much, because there might have been some sort of triage going on about what was the greatest threat and what was not. So I wouldn't draw too much from that. But NATO clearly did respond. It responded actually in a multinational fashion. It wasn't just a Polish response. There were also Dutch aircraft involved, even an Italian aircraft apparently. So I mean, in a sense, it shows that NATO is operationally prepared, and now clearly will be deeply focused on this mission. But there's also the political side of it, how the so-called Article 4 consultations in NATO are going, the kind of resolve that we will have to see now on both sides of the Atlantic, because remember, there are big questions about what the U.S. policy will be in all of this. And I have to think that this is a moment for Washington not only to talk tougher, but actually to start acting in tougher ways on Russian aggression.
I'd like to get your reaction to a remarkable exchange that unfolded yesterday on X. It began with Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban saying the incident proves that our policy of calling for peace in the Russia-Ukraine war is reasonable and rational. Living in the shadow of war is fraught with risks and dangers. It's time to make it stop. Now, a few hours later, the Polish foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, replied, "No, Victor, the incident proves you should get off the fence and condemn Russian aggression. We urge you to support tougher sanctions on the aggressor." So, Ian, what does this back and forth tell us about European and NATO solidarity?
Well, it underscores the fact that there are allies within the alliance who are not exactly on the same page. And this is even more true for the European Union than it is for NATO, I think. But it also, I think, not even reading between the lines, but simply reading Viktor Orban's message. I mean, it's clear that even if Hungary doesn't have the same sort of political approach to Russia, that they also feel that they're exposed to the spillover of violence from an ongoing war in Ukraine. And so this is meaningful for them, too. That was clear. I also understand the Polish foreign minister's comment, because at the political level, Europe, NATO needs Hungary and others to be on board when it comes to issues of sanctions and export controls and integrated air defense and other things that are going to be so important. So in a sense, both messages are telling us something important and significant.
Let me ask you before we run out of time, I mean, besides the exercises like the ones that were shown in our report, what else do NATO countries need to do to be ready for possible further Russian provocations?
Well, the short answer is a lot. Over the longer term, obviously, the immense amount of defense investment that's going to be required to build the capability in Europe, especially if Europe is going to have to do more of this on its own without the United States. for all kinds of reasons that we could discuss. But, clearly, if you were listening also to the State of the Union speech by President von der Leyen yesterday, air defense, investment in defense, military mobility. And I think these exercises are very much part of that equation. How do you move troops? How do you move equipment in a reliable manner in a way that Europe really hasn't had to think about since the end of the Cold War in this way? All of this has to come together to build capability that will both be reassuring to allies and deterring vis-a-vis Moscow.
Ian Lesser from the German Marshall Fund. Ian, it's good to have you on. We appreciate your insights today. Thank you.
Good to be with you.